The politics of the body is poised for me between the promise of metamorphosis and the fact of mortality, between the hope that we can keep reinventing ourselves inwardly and outwardly, and the awareness that the only certitudes are the passing of time and death. So what follows are two personal vignettes of metamorphosis and of mortality, two small nuggets of experience for you to play with later if you wish. Number one. Late on a chilly moonlit night in a village in Bengal after Kali Puja, about 5 years ago, I found myself in a large room full of men dressing up as women. It occurs to me as I write this now that none of these men had heard or is likely to hear of Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code. They were just as clueless about the drama being played out in the Delhi court around this terrible old law, and oblivious of the battle being fought against it in other pockets of urban India. The key words of that battle, lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgendered, safe and unsafe sex, queer rights, constitution, democracy, would probably never figure in the consciousness of these men. Yet that night, the atmosphere in the room was electric with erotic possibilities, although there were no women around. The men in it were dressing up for the night-long gajon, a medley of playing, dancing, and singing that was going to start soon in the middle of the marketplace, fantastically lit up and already packed with people just outside the room. Because I am a man, I had been allowed inside what was being called the ladies' room. Here, two men in their early 20s and two veteran male actors in their 30s and 40s, the oldest being the Gajon Lakshmi, the diva of the local theatre circuit, were briskly getting ready for their opening appearances on stage as women. I could hear continual announcements outside heralding the young actors as the hot heroines of the Adi Joymakali Theatre Company. I had already realized that they were household names in the village, where men, women, and children were all eager to share with me their awe of the actors' cross-dressing skills. In the dressing room, the men had sat down in a circle on the mud floor in the glare of a naked bulb, each with his little box of makeup, the sort of aluminium box in which children take their books to school. After a drag from their bidis, or subaltern cigarettes, and a quick bow to the goddess, Kali, they started making up their faces and necks with astonishing deftness, while a young wardrobe boy ran around handing them things and combed out their flowing black wigs. It was obvious that they didn't want to be disturbed, so I disappeared into the shadows with my camera, which they had allowed me to use, although they showed nothing but indifference to it. Suddenly, from where I was crouching, I realized that the room was surrounded by boys and men peering in through the holes and rents in the plastic sheets that formed its walls. Some of them had even started moving into the room through the door. From now on, at every new stage of the actors' spectacular transformation into women, there was a stepping up of the tension in the room. It reached a peak when the wardrobe boy started handing out the bras and falsies. The children were quickly shooed out, and the adults came in and shut the door, their eyes shining as they lurked in the shadows. In the hushed silence, I could hear the unmistakable gulping sound made by throats parched with arousal. Somehow, it felt improper to keep taking photographs. Then, all of a sudden, in that hush, someone jeered, "O bhai Brihannola," invoking Arjun's cross-dressed alter ego in the Mahabharata. The Gajan Lakshmi, the diva, now almost fully transformed into a resplendent Durga, looked sharply up at this man, held him in a long and icy stare, and with studied casualness ordered the wardrobe boy to throw everyone out of the room. Out I went too. For the Adi Joymakali cross-dressers, the night's performances were a roller coaster ride from the peaks of love to the pits of bawdry, with every kind of melodrama, abjection, and slapstick thrown in between. There were adulteries, murders, rapes, miscarriages, bed tricks, and someone called the Balloon Baba going around threatening to jab every well-endowed woman in the audience with a very sharp pin. I learned later that there were objections from most villagers and within the company to women being employed as actors, but not for the usual moralistic reasons. Most people felt that with the entry of women, the performances would have to be chastened. The male actors would not feel free enough to let themselves go in the ribald scenes if they involved real women. So men playing women remained the better option for both actors and audience. After the night's revels were over and the marketplace was almost empty, I saw two young actors standing against the door to that dressing room at dawn. They had changed into men's clothes, but had kept their wigs and makeup on. Around them was a gathering of shifty-eyed men who seemed unable to tear themselves away from their favorite heroines. After a while, most of these men cleared off, casting furtive little backward glances as they walked away. The two who remained went up to the actors, spoke to them briefly, and they all disappeared into the bamboo grove behind the dressing room. Later, when I got to know the Gajan Lakshmi, the diva, a little more, he told me how they would have sex, unprotected sex, with the men from the audience. But this happened only while the actors were still made up, he added with a touch of virtue in the voice, and never, he emphasized, after they had changed back into men. Part 2. The Institute of Liver and Biliary Sciences in the dusty outer reaches of Delhi's Vasant Kunj sounds like an unlikely setting for epiphanies. A massive new stone, glass, and concrete structure that is named after liver and bile would have delighted the Baroque imagination of someone like Robert Burton, the 17th century anatomist of melancholy. But when I checked in there for an indefinite stay, as my mother's carer 3 years ago, the monumental grimness of the place chilled my heart. It was towards the end of January, the nadir of the Delhi winter. The sky remains grey and leaden for entire days, and the cold sinks into one's bones as the evening settles. But the sun coming out would have made no difference to the inmates of the institute, for daylight never enters the building. There is a vast, high atrium, but if you stand in it and look up, you will get no glimpse of the sky. You are surrounded by walls with rows and rows of window frames that look out on one another. Through them, you see endless tableaus of care, in both senses of the word, arranged in sky-high grids. Each window frame presented a mix of mortality and minimalism, human beings absorbed in the antiseptic business of being ill, getting well, or dying. This hospital is the sort of place where the nurses only do specialized nursing. Patients have to have their own carers, staying with them day and night. So the building holds patient and carer alike in its stone embrace, or in a giant womb of echoing silence, broken from time to time by the clatter of metal on enamel or glass, or the muted whoosh of state-of-the-art elevators. The place is too huge for little human noises. So the brief vignettes one caught in the window frames were like fragments of silent cinema. A boy sitting on a stool by his grandfather's bed, keeping watch on the old man's drip and trying not to topple off the stool in his drowsiness. A sweeper quickly pocketing something that looks reusable from a bedside bin. A young doctor gazing deep into the eyes of another at the foot of a woman in coma. My mother and I usually stayed at a government hospital near Old Delhi when we came from Calcutta to see her doctor. And the Bruegelian chaos of the place always made me think of it as a republic or even a carnival of care. But there was something Lenten about the Liver Institute, as the rickshaw drivers called it. If the government hospital was a republic, then this was the state,
with more than a touch of Foucault's panopticon to it. Yet, every afternoon at 5 or so, when visiting hours started, I waited for a very special moment inside this sunless mausoleum that I can only describe as magical. It was a moment that gathered within itself all the somberness, anxiety, and suffering of the place and transformed them into an interregnum of lightness, an overcoming of gravity, which was all the more tender and precious because it was so fleeting and precarious. Most of the carers, especially of the elderly, struck me as remarkably young. College girls or boys pressed into care by the family because their time was the most easily colonizable compared to their older kin who went to do proper work. I would see these young people hunched over their ailing kin all day with a look of unqualified and self-effacing devotion. Some of them were obviously from the villages or small towns, or from, say, Bangladesh or the Northeast, and they came to the institute with bedding and chattels because they were going to have to stay there indefinitely, in a place far away from home. These young carers seemed to give themselves over to a form of service that brought out what was most obedient and familial in them. To my eyes, their attitudes and expressions suggested structures of feeling and allegiance that went back to the old feudal patriarchal extended family. It was at once touching and disturbing to see this obedience, this unquestioning dedication on the faces and bodies of people so young. I wondered if they ever resented their time and other resources being taken for granted like this. Was there never any moment of resistance or contrariness in their compliance with what was expected of them by their families? What sort of freedom or independence from the family would they enjoy when they grew up, if they grew up at all? In the welfare states of the Western world, young people, however ill their immediate family, would never have to give of themselves in this way or to this physical extent, because the state takes that responsibility to a very great extent upon itself. And that determines their experience of being young and of being old, what it means to be an adult in relation to the people we care for or are expected to care for. At 5 p.m., the visitor's bell would ring at the Liver Institute, and the other kin poured in. I saw the younger carers taking their chance to slip out from their bedside vigil into the common area on each floor. And the moment they stepped out, they pulled out their mobile phones. In seconds, their faces would begin to glow, and their eyes glitter as they paced up and down, oblivious to everything else, talking into their phones. Suddenly, a great weight seemed to have been lifted off their shoulders and minds, so that they appeared almost to float in that hard-bought and short-lived feeling of weightlessness. Sometimes I would eavesdrop on their conversations. They were mostly romantic. I realized that it happened to me too, and exactly at the same hour when the light was the gloomiest outside. This peculiar feeling of lightness or levitation as I spoke on the phone to my companion or a friend in another city or hemisphere. I felt like an alien calling from another planet. I called it planet care. But because it was happening to such a large body of people stuck in the same place, the whole air of the place would lighten all of a sudden and change miraculously. It would remind me always of those unforgettable moments in an otherwise terrifying and oppressive film, Tarkovsky's Solaris, when everyone inside the abandoned spaceship, marooned above a sea of consciousness, would experience a few minutes, or was it seconds, of weightlessness. The ravaged and death-haunted hero of Tarkovsky's film and his phantom wife returned from the dead would wait in the ship's library full of strange old objects and hung with Bruegel's winter landscapes for that parenthesis in time in which they would begin to float to the music of Bach. Somewhere between hopelessness and comfort. The poet John Keats, for whom youth and sexual ardor was inseparable from the fear of infection and the chill of death, once had a similar vision in a dream, which he then turned into a sonnet a couple of years before he died in his mid-20s in Rome. Reading and writing poetry become closely linked in this sonnet with the mingling of life and death, desire and decay, which his own youth and sexuality meant for Keats as carer, lover, and poet. This particular dream of Keats comes out of his reading of Dante's Inferno, but ends up in the dragon world with its 100 eyes, brutally mortal, yet shot through with beauty. That second circle of sad hell, where in the gust, the whirlwind and the flaw, of rain and hailstones, lovers need not tell their sorrows. Pale were the sweet lips I saw, pale were the lips I kissed, and fair the form I floated with about that melancholy storm.